Hello, my name is Joshua Landis. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce to you Matthew Barber. He is a PhD student at the University of Chicago and has been studying the Yazidi community in Iraq for the last several years. He was there this summer when the Yazidi community of Sinjar was overrun by the Islamic State, sending out hundreds of thousands of refugees into his region where he was. And he began to interview both these communities and discovered that thousands of women had been taken as slaves in the Yazidi community, and many men had been executed and held hostage. He's here giving a lecture at the University of Oklahoma. Matthew, welcome to the University of Oklahoma.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
This summer, you were in the middle of, you were in Kurdistan of Iraq, right next to the Sinjar mountain and the Yazidis. When they were attacked, the entire mountain, Sinjar mountain, their home, was overrun by the Islamic State, and the refugees began pouring out into Dohuk, where you were, and you began to interview them. We've subsequently discovered that many women were taken as slaves. How did you figure that out? This has been quite controversial, and many more than Boko Haram, for example, which has 200 or 300 women enslaved, but has caused a sensation around the world. How did you discover that this was going on, and why were people skeptical?
Well, when the refugees first began to flood into Dohuk and I began to visit them, I was hearing a lot of different stories. I was collecting as many accounts from survivors as I could, and I started to notice several patterns emerge, and one was that people were mentioning missing female family members. People were reporting that they had received calls from their daughters or sisters who were being taken into captivity. Some people were able to call their family members even as they were being carted off in trucks because they still had their cell phones with them. So as I began to notice this pattern, it was indicating that there was some kind of kidnapping phenomenon. And a lot of people were noticing it, local Yazidis in the Dohuk area, but people weren't sure what to make of it yet. And over time, it became clear that it was a sexually motivated campaign to actually take large numbers of concubines, to take Yazidi women and place them into jihadist homes, basically as domestic servants / sex slaves.
How did you begin to figure out that this was the purpose, and that in fact there was a plan to do this before the attack on Sinjar Mountain? I mean, why wasn't it? It would seem that this could just be, an opportunistic attack.
Right. There was a lot of skepticism at the beginning, and there was a lot of denial on the part of the IS jihadists themselves. Online, I was attacked quite frequently by IS supporters who claimed that I was fabricating this to defame the Islamic State and so forth. But I talked to survivors. I collected several survivor accounts from Sunni Kurds as well, who had lived in the Sinjar city and seen everything unfold. And they explained that as they were fleeing along with their Yazidi neighbors down the mountain, IS jihadists arriving to attack the mountain, and the first wave of soldiers, they had trucks with them, empty trucks that they had brought along, ready to take the women down with them. And they stopped the convoy of fleeing civilians, separated people out by religion, told the Sunnis to go back to Sinjar city. Of the Yazidi families, they separated the men from the women, and they immediately began herding the women together, loading them onto trucks, and taking them away. So it was clear that the entire campaign against Sinjar was not exclusively about military strategy or gaining a hold on strategic territory, but it was also a sexually motivated campaign, and it was premeditated, it was about carrying these women off. And after, even though we were met with a lot of skepticism, those of us that were talking about it, on the part of journalists or some people in the analyst community, a couple months later, IS issued an official article actually disclosing to the public that this absolutely was indeed their plan, that they were conducting this project, and that they were providing a scriptural basis for doing so, religious justifications. So they themselves have removed all doubt as to the reality of this campaign. And it was ironic when the very IS supporters that were denying that this was actually happening ended up being contradicted by IS themselves, who came out and publicly acknowledged and admitted that this was the project that they were conducting.
Now, why were they conducting this project? What do they think they were doing? What was the justification for it?
I think that if we ask why are they conducting this project, ultimately it comes down to a kind of selfishness. This is a kind of project that involves sexual gratification for the jihadists that are conducting it. But in terms of the justifications that they give, they actually believe that it's spiritually advantageous to revive the institution of slavery according to their interpretation of early Islamic slavery norms. Because they actually believe that, and they've stated this in their articles, that for men to have available sexual alternatives to their wives that are permissible in God's eyes, this being the concubine category, will allow them to maintain sexual purity. Whereas if they didn't have the concubine slave available, they would be tempted to sleep with their hired maids or other women that they're forbidden to have intercourse with. We don't know how many jihadists are taking kidnapped women as slaves, but we do know that we have an estimate that between 6,000 and 7,000 Yazidi people have been kidnapped. That includes some men who've been forced to convert to Islam, but the great majority are women and girls, and we have almost 5,000 by name.
Now, how do you get these? How are you sure of this?
There's two methods to derive this estimate. One is collecting names from families who are now refugee families in the Doha Governorate who are saying, I'm missing this person, I'm missing this person. Though there are volunteers that have gone around and visited families, and families have reported how many people are missing. The other method is to speak to women who are actually in captivity via cell phones that they managed to keep hidden with them. This was something we didn't publicize for a long time because we wanted to protect those women and keep those links alive. But it's become very public over time, and the IS jihadists know that that's happening, and they know that everybody is aware of it. So we, myself and the people I've been working with on this problem, a team of Yazidi volunteers, we've been able to have direct contact with those women in captivity. And when we speak to them, we're able to get a sense of how many people are being held with them and in what locations. So we've known for a long time where the women are, how many there are, and we have called for action to help free them.
Now, let me ask you on the theological level, why enslave Yazidi women and not the Christian women? Because the Christians were expelled as well, right? How is there a difference in treatment, or is it all the same?
There's a very big difference in how IS approaches different minority groups, and they have a system for differentiating what kind of treatment they believe each group deserves to have. The Christians belong to an Islamic category. This is not something that Christians self-identify as, but it's an Islamic label for a limited number of minorities that they call the people of the book. Christians and Jews belong to that category, and the IS jihadists believe that they have a certain limited number of rights. This summer, IS expelled Mosul's entire Christian community from the city. It's the first time in history for Mosul to not have a
Now, why do they
presence.
expel them? Shouldn't they be protecting them? Don't the Ahl al-Kitab have rights within the Islamic community?
Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, do have rights, but IS interpretation of those rights mean that Christians need to either convert to Islam, or if they don't convert to Islam, to pay a certain kind of poll tax, a head tax called jizya. And they issued an ultimatum to Christians this summer that said, pay this tax, or convert to Islam, or be dealt with by the sword. The Christians chose to leave. So I was very interested to understand this summer why the Christian communities chose to flee rather than stay and try to pay the jizya tax, since in various periods of Islamic history, minorities like Christians had paid the jizya tax, and these Christians in Mosul, though heavily persecuted, they've managed to survive a decade of al-Qaeda violence that targeted their community following the war in Iraq, the security vacuum after the US-led invasion. So I asked many families, why didn't you just stay and pay the jizya? And the responses that I received had to do with the fact that people were just too terrorized. They were already so scared because of the precedent that IS had set in dealing with other minorities. There are several minorities like the Shebek and the Yazidis that had already been targeted with campaigns of mass kidnapping. When IS first invaded Mosul, the Shebek communities were attacked. Their sheep were carried off. Their houses were pillaged. A lot of people were killed. Christians were very uneasy, and the fact that this group issued an ultimatum, one of the options of which was be dealt with by the sword, it didn't exactly instill trust. So if IS really wanted to keep this community as part of the new social landscape that they're trying to engineer, they could have done a lot of things to give the Christians more assurances. Another thing was that the Christians weren't even sure who to pay the jizya to or how much it would be. There was a lot of confusion on that level. And beyond all of this, there were several measures of economic oppression that IS had already levied against the Christian population when they took the city. And this wasn't reported in any media that I could find. And I've been planning to write about this on Syria Comment, but have been too distracted by all of the chaos that I've been dealing with. But the families that ended up fleeing this larger Mosul community of Christians, what I learned from many different people, and I heard the same narrative everywhere, was that the IS fighters went through and confiscated their salaries. A lot of people in the city of Mosul, a lot of Christians, were state employees. They were school teachers. They worked at hospitals as doctors. They were working in the utilities. They worked for the water company, the electricity company. IS engaged in a tactic that's very similar to how the Syrian secret police, the Mukhabarat in Syria, worked, where the government had an agent working in each hotel, in each hospital, monitoring the environment there. IS has done the same thing. They've installed a representative in each hospital, for example, in each company, to implement their policies. And that person was going to the managers of these utilities, of these institutions, and requesting a list of employees. They could tell who's Christian by looking at their names. They would tell the manager, don't pay these particular individuals, redirect these salaries to us. Christian employees would show up to work. Manager would call them aside, would say, I'm very sorry, but there's nothing I can do about this. I have no salary to give you. IS has confiscated it. So there's some irony in that IS is demanding jizya payment from a community whose very economic sustenance they've already sabotaged and reappropriated for themselves. So I believe that IS' approach to a lot of the minorities is based on economic strategies to reappropriate their wealth. When they made it so uncomfortable that Christians opted to leave, they were able to just seize everything that Christians owned, their homes, their cars, everything. Families told me, women told me, they took the wedding ring right off my finger as I was leaving the city. Many people told me this story.
So how is the Yazidi community different from the Christian community, Ahl al-Kitab?
IS targets the Yazidi community with a greater level of violence than they did the Christians. Even though they dispossessed the Christians of all their wealth as they exited Mosul, they didn't engage in a widespread campaign of slaughter or enslavement. There have been reports of some kidnappings of Christians and some killings, and in a context of war that makes sense. But there's been no wide-scale project to kidnap and enslave women or slaughter, exterminate the Christian population. The Yazidis, however, don't qualify for the same Islamic protections that the Christians do as a member of the people of the book category from the IS fighters' perspective.
Why not?
They believe that Yazidis are polytheistic. Yazidis do not have a written scripture, so they can't be considered people of the book when they don't actually have a book. Yazidis have an oral tradition. They actually have scriptural texts. They're oral texts. They're oral traditions, prose narratives, and sacred hymns. So on many levels, the IS and Islamists generally view the Yazidis as a pagan, polytheistic community. They've been labeled as devil worshippers by many people. And the IS jihadists believe that they don't have the right to exist in Muslim lands. They've even stated that God will hold Muslims accountable for having allowed the Yazidis to exist for this long, for this period of time. So whereas they gave the Christians three options, convert to Islam, pay jizya, or be killed, when they went into Sinjar, they gave many people just two options, convert to Islam or be killed. Those that refused were often killed. There were several cases this summer of widespread massacres. Those usually only happened to the men, and after they would kill the men, they would take the women and enslave them. So they believe that follows the precedent of the wars of the early Islamic era centuries ago.
Is this new for the Yazidis to be attacked like this under ISIS? Is ISIS a new phenomenon that's unknown to the region?
That's a very good question. It's a controversial question. Many people now are claiming that ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, for example, that everything that they're doing is kind of an anomaly. There hasn't been enough publicity of the kidnapping campaign. I believe that most Muslims around the world, if they had knowledge of what was actually happening to the Yazidis, they would absolutely condemn it outright. It's unconscionable. However, to say that this has no precedent in Islamic history is absolutely not true, because Yazidis were targeted with very similar violence for several centuries under Ottoman rule. During the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, there were multiple campaigns of pogrom-like violence against Yazidis. They were attacked in Sinjar and in the Nineveh plain. There were massacres. There were attempts to force convert them. There were times when mosques were built and they were forced to go in and learn to pray in the mosque in the Islamic fashion. Usually after the Ottoman troops would leave, they would go back to being Yazidi. In the midst of all of that violence, it was also common for women to be taken away by Ottoman soldiers during these campaigns of violence against Sinjar. And those women were sold in slave markets inside Anatolia, in places like the slave market in Mardin. There are historians that have chronicled this. So the Yazidis have survived a legacy of persecution, and the persecution that they were targeted with under the Ottomans is not all that different than what they're experiencing today under ISIS. ISIS is just able to do it in a much more far-reaching, much more expansive fashion because of modern weaponry and the ability to go in and...
So what's this done to the Yazidi community? What kind of what kind of reaction have they have, and what do you see for their future in Iraq?
Yazidis have lost their most important homeland, which is Sinjar. That's their largest population center, and it's been almost entirely depopulated. Almost the entire community now, around 300,000 people, are refugees. Yazidis feel a deep sense of betrayal right now vis-a-vis the Kurdistan regional government, because when ISIS first attacked the mountain, Sinjar mountain, on August 3rd, the Peshmerga forces, the Kurdish Peshmerga forces that were there to defend the mountain, they fled without a fight. Before the jihadists even reached the mountain, they cut and run. And unfortunately, none of the Peshmerga commanders that were responsible for those troops in Sinjar, none of them were Yazidi and none of them were from Sinjar. And Yazidis feel that they just became the lowest priority, whereas the Peshmerga would fight intensely to maintain their control over areas near Kirkuk. The Yazidis were just kind of expendable.
Now do Yazidis feel like Kurds, or do they feel like Yazidis, or what? How do they identify themselves?
There's been a trend of Yazidis in the Dohuk area identifying as Kurds, and the Yazidis of the Sinjar area identifying as Yazidi, as a separate ethnicity that's non-Kurdish. This summer's events and the betrayal that they feel by not being protected by the Kurdistan government or by the Peshmerga has exacerbated this trend of not identifying as Kurdish. So more and more Yazidis are identifying as just Yazidi, and they're saying outright, I'm not Kurdish, or I'm no longer Kurdish. And this is very upsetting for Kurds in power, because it contravenes the Kurdish national narrative, which is we're all Kurds, Yazidis are the original Kurds. Yazidis are mostly Kurdish speaking, so it's been important for Kurdistan to brand themselves as the protector of minorities.
Didn't many of the Kurds from Syria come and try to save? I thought there was a big effort by Kurds, the PYD, Kurds of Syria, to come over and save the Yazidis in Sinjar.
Absolutely they did. I had interviews with a number of survivors who, after they had escaped being trapped on top of the mountain for about a week, they told me the only people that helped us escape were the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish fighters. If they hadn't come, we would have died on the mountain. Many people told me this. So there was a great deal of gratitude for those Syrian Kurds who actually crossed the border and came to the defense of Sinjar, while the Iraqi Peshmerga forces that were responsible for that region weren't even responding. It's 3 months later now, and following 3 months of Obama's airstrike campaign on ISIS targets, the Peshmerga have still not conducted an offensive to take back Sinjar, even though President Barzani sent several hundred Peshmerga troops to go fight in Kobane, a long ways away in another country. And yet they still haven't gone to the aid of the Yazidi fighters that are trying, they're volunteers that are trying to protect a few villages that haven't fallen to IS on the mountain. President Barzani referred to the attack on Sinjar as a Kurdish genocide. And Yazidis feel like this is an attempt to co-opt their suffering and vulnerability in order to elicit sympathy for the Kurds generally. They really resent and find this implication offensive, that this was a Kurdish genocide, because they know that Sunni Kurds were spared and not targeted. They know that they're being killed and their shrines are being destroyed. because they are a religious minority that's considered unpalatable. So they highly resent the suggestion that this is a Kurdish genocide or violence against Kurds. It's the Yazidis specifically that have been ethnically cleansed.
I see. Now, you've just come back from Washington a few days ago where you've been campaigning with a bunch of Yazidi leaders who come to Washington to try to get the ear of people. What sort of people did you get to visit in Washington, and what kind of reaction did you get to this story?
We had a large delegation of Yazidi spiritual leaders, tribal leaders from Sinjar, researchers and professionals. This was the first time in history, to my knowledge, that Yazidi spiritual leaders have visited the United States. And we also had a number of volunteers who are part of the team trying to respond to the crisis of the kidnapped women. That includes myself. So our larger group of about 14 people, we went around and had meetings all over Washington, at the State Department, humanitarian organizations, people on Capitol Hill, congressional staff, think tanks, ambassadors whose job is to work on religious freedom, women's rights, human trafficking, all these problems. We went to talk to humanitarian organizations about the need for aid for refugees, and the climax of all of this week of meetings was a meeting at the White House with Ben Rhodes, who's one of the chief people that worked with President Obama on Middle Eastern policy. Our message everywhere in all of these meetings was that there were several agenda items. The main message was that Yazidis need an ability to self-protect if their governments, the regional government and the Iraqi central government, are not willing to protect them, willing or capable. And we also pushed very hard on the goal of helping free a great percentage of these women. We believe that several thousand of the kidnapped women can be freed very quickly if the right kind of action will be taken, short-term action.
What is that action? What do you mean by that?
That action would be using the airstrike campaign that Obama is already engaged with in conjunction with Kurdish or Yazidi ground forces to hit the IS targets that are near the mountain where the women are being held, or the women are being held captive. And if Yazidi forces or Kurdish forces go in, they can bring a lot of those women out.
Boy, Boko Haram has gotten so much attention. This has gotten almost no attention. Why hasn't it captured the imagination of journalists, of women's groups, of humanitarian groups around the world?
It's hard to say. We've been very frustrated by the fact that the media will not dwell and linger on this story. When Boko Haram kidnapped about 200 women, I think 200 schoolgirls, there was a great international outcry and it had a lot of attention.
The First Lady even got into the campaign.
But it was for a short period of time. Right. After a while, that story kind of dried up and disappeared. Those women are still in captivity. I don't think they came home. With the Yazidi women, the numbers of the kidnapped are in the thousands. Perhaps part of it is the fact that there's not much visual evidence. Of course, there wasn't of the kidnapped schoolgirls in Nigeria either. So we're not sure why there hasn't been more of an appetite to dwell on this story. There have been a number of great articles on it. The Washington Post, The Economist, people at the New York Times, Daily Telegraph. There have been a number of journalists from many different media outlets around the world who have written individual stories on this problem. But we haven't seen the major networks just spend time and give this the attention that they give to far less significant, far less important issues.
Matthew Barber, it was a pleasure talking with you today.